Testing, testing. 1, 2, 3, 3, 2, 1.
I'm going to turn that off or I'll get distracted. There we go. And there. So all of that. Oh, so you're with the, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Very soon to follow, yeah.
So basically, yes. Okay, yeah, we've been emailing, okay. I think they kind of sent out the letter like 6, but yeah, it's a nice, beautiful day, and people are like,
It
oh.
is. Yeah. And then I know that the attendance was really well for your session in the diversity
Yeah,
conference.
that was really
And
good.
that's the reason we want to do it again in case if people couldn't join the
Yeah.
conference.
So, hi. No, not late at all. That's fine.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to our second Brown Bag Lunch and Learn series of this semester. Hope you're all enjoying this beautiful weather. And then I would like to welcome all of our attendees in here and as well as our attendees online. So today it is my great pleasure to introduce you with Dr. Angela Tomshell. And our session for today is Overcoming Apathy, Anti-Apartheid Activism at SUNY Brockport. So Dr. Angela Tomshell actually presented this so during our diversity conference. We know that there was a lot of interest for this session, so that's the reason. So we invited Dr. Tomshell to present her studies with us for today. So before we do get started, I do have some ground rules that I will just go over with you. First, again, for those of you who do not know me, I am Medis Kural, and I go with the she, her pronoun, and I am the program coordinator for the Office of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. And I will be serving as the facilitator for today. So before we get started, I would like to take everyone's time and then to go with our land of acknowledgement. The Office of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion acknowledges, with the respect of indigenous people on whose land SUNY Brockport now stands, the Onondaga Nation of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. As an academic community, we are dedicated recognizing and promoting indigenous people's rights in our teaching, scholarship, and service. And we support the inclusion of indigenous students, staff, and faculty on our campus race and community. So this session is going to include a presentation from Dr. Angela Tomshell. So our our diversity graduate fellow Zoe White is going to be with us, and then make sure that we have actually moderation in our time. So for the first 30 minutes, Dr. Tomshell is going to have the presentation, and then the last 10 to 15 minutes, we will actually have the question and answer for the session. These are the major announcements from my part, but I would like to also take the time to thank you, the Department of Journalism and Broadcasting, especially our student interns who are really helping us to streaming the session today. So we wouldn't be able to do that without your help. So thank you so much. And especially I would like to recognize John Lutz and Tim Pratt. Again, I would like to be mindful of our audience that we are streaming the event for today, so that you will all be kept in the loop. And then these are the my announcements. And then please let me help to join Dr. Angela Tomshell for the presentation for today. Thank you so much for everybody.
Thank you, Melis. All right. Well, Melis Kamal has taken many of my initial thank yous, so I will step into it fairly quickly, but I did want to add a few other thank yous. One is to the Office of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, to Zoe, who's been working with me to get ready for today and for inviting me. But also to the Molefe family in South Africa. That is the family of one of the students I'm going to be talking about. Without their permission, it would have been very difficult to publish the article on which this work is based, because I draw a lot on Vernon Molefe's written work in our archives, and they kindly gave me permission to use that work, and that really enriched the project, and you'll hear about his fabulous work. So I'm also hopeful that the fact that we're able to stream this time versus the diversity conference, it means that they'll be able to see this, and that was one of the reasons I was particularly excited to accept this invitation today. As a little background, my work is British imperialism in Africa. I got to this because there was a call for papers. An academic journal was having a special edition on campus activism in the United States, or rather, pardon me, broadly. There's actually articles on campus activism in other African countries about anti-apartheid activism. And I saw this, and we actually had a professor, Dr. Bruce Leslie, who'd done a lot of work on education history, and so I brought it to his attention. But he was retiring and had a lot of other projects on his plate at the time, but by then I was already invested. And so I just started poking around, and what I found was so amazing that I went full into this, and this became a project I worked on, and then it's now published, and they're looking at turning the journal into a book collection that's going to hopefully come out next year. So I want to start by giving a little background to our viewers and to those of you here about apartheid, the history of it, and also activism, very brief, and then I'll get to Brockport's role in that. So apartheid was instituted in South Africa in 1948, but it built on a whole sheaf of colonial laws about racism that instituted racial segregation and racialized policies. What we tend to think of in the United States is what was called petty apartheid. And that's the Jim Crow-like laws that separated different races in public life. And this went beyond white and black South Africans to include colored, which was a term used in South Africa for people of mixed descent, and then Asians in later years. That qualification was added as well. So that was petty apartheid, but the ultimate aim was something called grand apartheid. And that was the complete segregation of races, so that the idea was to create basically states within South Africa called Bantustans that would be for each of the individual nations of black South Africans. So Zulu, Tswana, Sotho would have their own states within, and South Africa, the country, would be essentially a white state, and then it would have these embedded states within it. That never came to full fruition, thankfully, but that was the grand aim. And so there's just a whole host of laws that segregated and oppressed people of different races. So that's apartheid, and it was immediately pretty much led to protests that grow. And so in early days, for instance, Nelson Mandela is photographed burning his passbook that all black South Africans had to carry that identified your race and so on. But by 1960, there was in Sharpeville, and that's what this painting is of, there was what started out as a peaceful protest, and as is so often the case in South African history, there are conflicting accounts of what happened next, of whether peaceful protesters threw a stone or the police fired without provocation. Both sides differ in that history. But it ends up with police opening fire. 249 people were shot, 69 are reported dead, and again, those numbers are always contested because the official accounts are kept by the South African government, which is not trusted by the protesters at all. And so some of these include children. And I wanted to mention this act in particular, one, because it galvanizes a lot of attention across the world, but also because living in Sharpeville at that time, one of the well-known pastors was Reverend Molefe, who is Vernon Molefe's father. And Vernon was not yet born yet, the student I'm going to talk about, but his family lived in South Africa and his parents were there at the time of the Sharpeville massacre. Other things that you might be familiar with are Nelson Mandela's history, so kind of putting that in this context. He was part of the African National Congress leadership by the 1950s. And at that point, particularly in the 1950s, he was known more for his call that violence may be necessary to fight apartheid. And he led a group within the ANC known as the Spear of the Nation. And they were implicated in a number of acts of sabotage, and in fact, that's what he was arrested with at one point. There were treason charges in the 50s. They weren't dropped until 61. That drug on. But then he was rearrested in 1962. In 1964, that's when he's found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. And once Nelson Mandela drops off kind of public life entirely, people do not see or hear of him essentially until the very late 80s. He was kept far away in prison, especially, as most people know, in Robben Island for a good part of that. So there's a lull in activism, but in the 70s, you get the Black Consciousness movement, led by Stephen Biko in particular, who's a university student in South Africa. And then in 1976, there was a change in school laws, and there was an uprising in Soweto, and that really brings a lot of attention and gets us more to the history we're talking about. Because the change in laws was that they were going to force Black South African students who were already in poorly funded, not overfunded, overcrowded, poorly funded schools. They were going to change the language of instruction, and the teachers from English to Afrikaans, the language that was most associated with apartheid, and they don't speak this, the teachers don't speak it, and they have what I liken for my students, essentially their regents exams coming up, and suddenly they're shifting languages. And so there were peaceful protests, and particularly in Soweto, which is the Southwest Township, that's where the acronym comes from, outside of Johannesburg, where when they segregated the populations, most of the Black South Africans who lived in Johannesburg were forced into Soweto. So there was a peaceful protest there that once again turned violent, and police fired. The reports again contested. 176 is a number of officially dead, many of whom would have been essentially high school students, what here would be high school age students. That brought international attention, as did the murder of Stephen Biko by the police, and Peter Gabriel had a song, but attention really turned, and there's this huge wave of activism internationally, of which students in the United States are part of, but there's also enormous activism in South Africa, and there's increasing concern that South Africa will become ungovernable, and also concern that it's headed towards a race war. And that's when the South African government finally turns back to Nelson Mandela and starts approaching, they start having dialogues secretly at this point about potentially bringing him out and moving towards a democratic South Africa. So how does that look in the United States? So by the 1980s, there is widespread activism, but there had been some before. In 65 to 70, there was a wave. It does not register locally, essentially. Then in the second wave in the late 70s, in the wake of the Soweto uprising, and I did find some ripples of that at Brockport, but at that point it seemed to be largely students of African descent who were concerned about what was going on in apartheid. there was a group, the Black Student Liberation Front was one of our student groups at the time. And they published things in the Stylus. There were some articles. There was also a SUNY-wide meeting of students about anti-apartheid activism. And I found it really telling that one of the members of the Black Student Liberation Front wrote to the Stylus promoting the conference, but tellingly addressed herself to Black students. The assumption, at least on her part, was that this was not something that would interest the majority of Brockport students at that time, but only those of African descent. And then the 1980s, there was something called divestment, which was this huge push nationally in the United States for companies to have to stop investing their money in South Africa. And this hit universities because a lot of universities were deeply invested actually in companies that did business in South Africa, including SUNY. Brockport, I did not find evidence of that, but we had only recently gotten a foundation. SUNY laws had, SUNY policies had changed and let campuses have foundations, but ours was very new, and I think it's, their chief fundraiser at that point were still coin-operated laundries on campus. So I don't think it was a huge foundation that would have deep investment in those early years. But there was a wave of uprisings, or protests, pardon me, across campuses in the United States. In April 1985, to take some New York examples, several hundred students at Columbia University began a 3-week sit-in calling for divestment at their university. At Cornell, there were over 1,000 students who were arrested or at least detained in a series of divestment sit-ins. So these are drawing huge numbers of student bodies, and there's even bigger movements in, say, some Berkeley and some of the other California institutions. So there are protests going on all over the country, and there's almost nothing at Brockport, which is really interesting. We don't have large rallies. We don't have divestment sit-ins. We didn't have any of that, and yet we ended up being at the forefront of a lot of the activism. And that's what's so fascinating to me. It's what's coming is coming from a small body of students who worked somewhat quietly often, but really effectively to achieve change at Brockport. So to turn first to divestment, sorry, I should have left it there. I'll come back one second. There was, as I said, no sit-ins, nobody was arrested, but rather quietly in November 1984, Brockport's BSG voted to divest their funds from banks that were doing business with South Africa. They actually found that was virtually impossible to do in Brockport, unfortunately, because every bank was implicated, with the exception of something that was a savings and loan, which is a different kind of body that they would have had to pay a per check fee. And so they couldn't achieve it, but they quietly just voted almost unanimously to divest. And then there were also SUNY movements to pressure SUNY, and Brockport students were involved in some of those movements at Albany, but they were still relatively small. The group that was really active was the Organization for Students of African Descent that had been founded in some ways as kind of an alternative to the Black Liberation Student Front, but also I think became something of a successor in some ways. So they have a number of campus events. Largely what they would do is bring in speakers. Some of them were controversial. And some of them related to apartheid in particular. So they brought in Louis Farrakhan, which generated complaints on campus, I should say. There were letters to the editor about BSG funds being used for someone so controversial that were then rebuked. There were letters back supporting that this is exactly what we should be using funds for, to bring a diversity of ideas and voices to campus. But they also brought, and this picture shows one of these talks, Dumasani Khumalo, who was exiled from South Africa in 1977 for his activism against apartheid. And so they brought him to campus to talk about his experiences and to tell students about apartheid and the movements to bring it to a close. And then they just also had dances and events on campus, and were a really active organization at the time. They show up in the newspaper and the yearbook. Saga is our yearbook, and so they showed up there quite a lot. And I think that's important because they were a community. You see the same people in a lot of these photographs. I think they supported each other, and they worked together as a unit. And I think that's what's so critical for them, because by and large, most people, there were not a lot of attendance at some of these talks. There weren't, as I said, big movement at Brockport, but it was an effective movement. Because one of the things they do early on is award Nelson Mandela an honorary degree at SUNY Brockport. And all degrees from SUNY, like honorary degrees, are issued by the State University of New York. But as the nominating campus, the award was given at Brockport. But it has to go through a process at the campus it's nominating and at the SUNY level to get approved. And awarding Nelson Mandela an honorary degree likely doesn't seem that radical, but at the time that Brockport put in the application, only one other college in the United States had issued an honorary degree to Nelson Mandela, and that was the City College of New York. The University of Michigan, which is my graduate alma mater, had put in a application at about the same time that SUNY Brockport did. And it was initially rejected. There were massive protests with hundreds of students involved, faculty writing letters, and this draws a lot of public attention and media, and eventually the University of Michigan trustees did agree, and so they became the second university in the United States to award Mandela a degree. Meanwhile, at Brockport, the application is put in, and it left so little trace, I can't tell you exactly who instigated this at Brockport. Interviews with people who were here at the time and were involved suggest that OSAD played a formative role. Particularly Dr. Reverend Joel Tolliver, who was the director of Minority Affairs at the time, credited OSAD with the fact that we gave Mandela an honorary degree. Newspapers and so forth credited faculty, a committee of students, faculty, and staff, the VP of Student Affairs, Dr. John McCrae, and Joel Tolliver is mentioned many times in these. So it seems to have involved a number of different people, but OSAD was critical. And SUNY does approve it. It seems to have been somewhat contentious, but I can't prove that. It's just reading between the lines of some of the records, as well as the fact that when we put in our paperwork to nominate him, we put in with 3 other people, some mostly literary and journalists, and those were approved relatively quickly, and their awards were given in April of '87. It was 6 months before Nelson Mandela's was approved, and it was not awarded until November of '87. So that's one of the things that makes me think this was a more contentious application. But the record of that is also not there. And so we became the 3rd university or college in the United States to award Nelson Mandela a degree. And at the ceremony to do so, there were 1,000 people in attendance. This was also when Sankofa was getting started to a certain degree. There had been African dance troops on campus and clubs and organizations since the late 70s, but we have just at this point hired, now I'm suddenly blanking, and I have his material, and I didn't write his name down because I know it, and then I'm forgetting. But we hired a dance professor who was really seminal in bringing Sankofa to the fore, and that's him performing right there. And I'm so sorry to those watching that I'm suddenly blanking. But this became the first time that Sankofa performed at something akin to a convocation, and it has been doing so ever since. So in some ways, that's the biggest legacy, or the most, I should say, visual, evident legacy we have at Brockport of all of these movements right now is the fact that we still have Sankofa performing at many of our convocations and commencements. And so that's where that history comes from. But we also had...
Clyde?
Pardon?
Was it Clyde?
Yes, Clyde Morgan. Thank you so much, President McPherson.
I was able to find it, so I didn't mean to interrupt, but it's important that we have his name.
Yes, thank you. I was so embarrassed I was forgetting. This is Dr. Clyde Morgan, who, while he's retired, he is also one of the reasons I have this history is because before he left, he sent out a memo detailing some of the history of Sankofa, of which this was a piece. And so that became part of the record for this. So yes, thank you very much. Another person who came in was Neo Numzana, sorry, I was not pronouncing that correctly, the chief representative of the African National Congress, came to the United States, and he was here, and they came to Brockport and had some teach-ins, and also was part of the awards night, and accepted the award on Mandela's behalf. So I think it cannot be underscored that this was a really significant moment for SUNY Brockport, and for our history, and that's one of the things for those of you who are here, those of you who are watching, I would love to have more ideas about how we as a campus can better remember and commemorate this event where despite, colleges can talk about these big movements, we actually achieved something rather quickly. Where there were student sit-ins other places, there's a lot of research that suggests they didn't achieve what they were hoping to achieve. Whereas our students worked fairly quietly, but concertedly and with faculty and staff and administration, and we were able to leave a lasting mark by awarding a degree, which at the time was still contentious. So there were some protests, not protests, but letters of complaint again, that were sent to SUNY that we were awarding Nelson Mandela a degree. The complaints they had were that remember, he's still in jail at this point. He has not been heard from decades, and when he was last heard from, he was leader of the Spear of Nation. And so they're saying they do not know of him as peaceful activism, but as violent activism. So some people, one man wrote a fairly reasonable letter that we should be paying attention to apartheid, that we should be taking action, but that to award it to someone associated with violent action was not appropriate. But then there were the conservative talking points in the United States were much more damning about Mandela. And they said he was communist, which had to do with South African law. They defined communism as anyone who protested the status quo, but as the status quo was apartheid, that meant that anyone who challenged apartheid could be labeled a communist in South Africa. But this works for conservative viewpoints in the United States during the Cold War. So he is a communist, he had extreme violence, and that this is not who we should be celebrating, that SUNY's really gone astray, and there was very strong feelings on that point. But the trustees defended it in an interesting wording at what point, that they had conferred it upon Mr. Mandela, quote, in recognition of his effort to obtain human rights for his countrymen and others throughout the world, which is interesting because they're not defending him and his record, but the movement for which he stands. And so that was another piece that made me think this might have been more contentious, but that was the line they found, was that this was a way to protest apartheid and to mark SUNY's opinions on that, while also not necessarily embracing everything that Nelson Mandela had at that point been associated with. All right, but unfortunately after 1,000 people come, after this huge moment that's in all the press and everyone's talking, they seem to go back to apathy being the kind of byword of Brockport students. There was a rally 2 years later in 1989 seeking petitions again for ending apartheid, and they gathered 120, but apparently turnout was low. And one student said, "It's sad to think that such a small amount of this school would stand up for this cause." And Reverend Joel Tolliver, who is still involved in all of this, said, "It's about time students came out of their apathy." So that was the view in 1989, so shortly really after this culminating event. Unbeknownst to him, probably in the audience who signed, I'm wondering, I wish I could find that, was Vernon Molefe. Because, thank you, one of what Vernon Molefe becomes known for at Brockport is he almost individually spearheads a movement to create 3 scholarships to bring Black South African students to Brockport to study at a university and get them out of apartheid, bring them here and give them access to our education. And this is so much his story that I want to give a little background. He was a student and a musician in Sharpeville when he drew the ire of South African authorities by protesting against their educational restrictions. So he fled to Lesotho in the company of his friend, who's now known to us as Lebo M, the writer of Lion King. So the two of them were musicians. They went and performed together in Lesotho. They got noticed. There's differing histories here of exactly how they got noticed, what exactly happened. But one story is it was the American ambassador who helped arrange for their immigration to the United States and to attend school. Eventually, Lebo M ends up on the West Coast pursuing his musical career, and Molefe is at John Jay College of Criminal Justice in New York City. And it's at that point he reads about the Nelson Mandela Award at Brockport and thinks, this is where I need to be. This is a campus that has the right approach and that I will find Confederates that I can be with. And he shows up, and he was deeply disappointed that those students must have graduated, and he was not finding a campus that was fired up about apartheid. And so he made it happen, essentially. He writes the then president of SUNY Brockport, who actually was very supportive and said, get me a proposal. So he starts working with faculty, including Professor Felix Okoye, who was part of our African-American Studies department. Reverend Joel Tolliver, of course, was part of this. And they put together this proposal. But every time you can kind of feel like Vernon Molefe driving things and the faculty and staff running behind being like, wait, we have to go a little slower. There's policy, there's procedures, and he's gone ahead. They filed something asking for something from the administration, and he's already organized a press conference, assuming it's going to come through. He is organizing fundraising events. He is going to other fundraising events, approaching people. So there were silent protests. He started reaching out to the South African community in Rochester. He works closely with a Rochester anti-apartheid community group that invites people from that to campus to speak to them, to hear, and they actually get quite a lot of the funding for the scholarship from them. But also all along the way, Vander Wettering, the president, is working as well, and they get waivers for tuition. And amazingly, they're able to pull off in 1 year funding 3 scholarships. One is a full 4-year scholarships, 1 graduate and 2 undergraduate scholarships for students to come from South Africa, which they do. They then have to identify the students. That was a whole nother ordeal of identifying the students and working through channels to bring them here. But we do end up having 3 South African students come on these scholarships and graduate and go back. And some, it appears some stayed. I've had trouble tracking all of them down. Others return. But what happens to Vernon Molefe is a different story. So I know a lot of this, he, as a kind of independent study project, recorded all of this, the minutes of the meetings, his letters, his kind of memory of what happened. He wrote a paper that prefaces this whole collection of documents, which is a fantastic collection in our archive. And in that initial piece where he's describing the process, he talks about the cost to himself and that it cost him his grades. It cost him friendships, that all of this work came at a price for him. He also, in a very chilling sentence, says it's also led to threats on my life. And then that's when I started looking and discovered that 2 years later, roughly, he was assassinated, or he was murdered. His family says he was assassinated, but he was murdered. That case has never been closed, is still outstanding. He was shot twice in the head early in the morning, getting into his cab that he was then driving in Rochester while finishing his degree. So whether the police finding was that this was not related to his activism vis-a-vis South Africa and apartheid. The family contests that. So it's not a definitively, I don't want to say that is absolutely something that comes out of this. There were a number, unfortunately, of unsolved murders in Rochester that year, as with many years. And so, but that's the conclusion of that, the very, very sad conclusion of that story, is that Vernon Molefe is no longer here to give us that history and to tell us his side of these events, and why I was so grateful to his family that they let me use his record to do so. But the activism continued. There was a huge outpouring of support from the community, from Rochester, from Brockport. There was a fund that actually by this point one of his brothers and one of his sisters have joined him. The fund enabled them to not only repatriate him back to South Africa to be buried, by his family, but to send his brother and sister back to, cover all of his expenses here. This outpouring came from all the people whose lives he'd impacted at Brockport and in the Rochester community through his activism, including one of the people who was there with the family, helping them write a letter saying we would appreciate support at this time, was one of the students he'd helped bring from South Africa with that fundraising. So they wrote how he was still even, helping them out, helping them adjust, helping them with everything. So he was just this force behind the scenes. And that's another piece I would love to see more recognition of all that he did for our campus at that point, and bringing such a vital issue to light and making it something that suddenly people were talking about. With Vernon Molefe here, articles on in the Stylus about apartheid, it's unbelievable. It's essentially in 1 year that he was here, they published as many as they published in the decades before he was here. He just made apartheid something that Brockport was attentive to, looking at, and discussing in momentous ways. So that's a history I see of what does this tell us about overcoming apathy. It doesn't have to happen with the sit-ins or the shanty towns that a lot of universities, the students created these replica poor housing to protest the kind of housing people had in South Africa. And that's where the research says that wasn't necessarily bringing any change. And yet our students working with faculty, working with staff and administration were able to achieve two really important moments. One, the degree for Nelson Mandela, and secondly, a scholarship which there were similar efforts at our schools. I've looked at some of the, and it takes years. The fact that this took 1 year from start to finish, to bringing students onto campus, getting them situated, housing, tuition, insurance, which was another issue. One of them joined the soccer team, and that's when they found out that soccer wasn't covered. So there was some fundraising for that when he got an injury. And the health. I mean, there are so many pieces to this that this is a phenomenal effort, and our students did it at SUNY Brockport. And so for people who are interested in using this history for activism, I think some of it, the support OSAD have for each other with their community and their slow and steady efforts are really critical, supporting each other and not being sidelined when people critique them, which they did. They said things when they would have a fundraiser, they would say, this is a drop in the bucket, what are you doing? And they're like, every drop counts. They just kept pushing back. What we're doing matters, even if it's small. And then with Vernon Molefe, having somebody who's willing to turn basically their whole life into this force to drive forward something, but it can happen both ways. You don't have to have someone like him, one of these kind of once in a generation of students person on your cause. You can also have it slower, steadier by building community and not being deterred when people critique your efforts. Thank you very much for coming, and I'm happy to take questions. Yes, I'll come first. Miles is in my class, so I know their name. I'll come first.
Do you think that we could see a renewal of activism on such topics in the future?
I absolutely think, because we could have a renewal of activism, student bodies change in the kind of outlook, and students today are less prone to be activists than in certain other decades. But it comes and goes, there are waves, and what it takes are students who are committed to it, who want it to happen, and who are willing to work for it and working to build connections out. So looking just at our own record, it comes and goes in waves, and it's not as steady as that, but it does come and go. So I absolutely think that we could have students at SUNY Brockport invest in this, because as one note, our student body now is not that different from then. There were a lot of commuters, and commuters are less involved in student activism, generally speaking, nationally, because they're not on campus all the time. We had a lot of people who are, not from, they're having to work. They don't have wealthy background that enables them to just focus on school and extracurricular activities. They're working at the same time. And so I think we have a similar demographic, similar concerns amongst our students. And so it's absolutely possible if people are willing to put that in. And Dr. McPherson, you had a question as well.
It's actually almost more of a statement, and that's to note that if we were to put Nelson Mandela forward for an honorary degree today, we would not be allowed to give it to him because the rules have changed and they have to have a clear connection to the campus. So you have to have somebody who has been on campus, who has given to the campus, who has taught at the campus, etc. So it's a really interesting change that's been made now. To give another kind of example, there was a movement this past spring for the Ukrainian president to become get an honorary degree. A number of Rochester colleges wanted to band together for that, and we were not allowed to be part of that because we didn't have the connection that would have made that a connection. So that's just kind of interesting contemporary historical fact, as it were. The other thing to note is President van der Wettering was very actively involved in international education, so it's a wonderful alignment of interests that probably allowed that to happen so quickly.
Thank you. Thank you. And I should mention, the rule you mentioned was in place, but it was clearly less enforced at the time. There was a line on the application where the nominators had to say how the person was connected to SUNY Brockport. And that's one of the reasons I'm so desperate to find, but I just have not found our application to see how they made that justification. But looking at a few others, the connection at the time could be somewhat tenuous. One person had come and given a talk here once before, and their work aligned with, it was a fairly tenuous connection, and yet that was allowed to go pretty quickly through. So it sounds like they are enforcing that a little more carefully now than they used to, which, yeah, well, I'm glad we gave it to them when we could. Any other questions or comments? Yeah, okay, Miles.
Do you know if the amount of students from South Africa has increased since the 80s or not?
I do not but I don't think we have many.
A number of African students. We have a number of African students, but South African students, I don't think have any South African students currently. The largest number of students from Africa come to us from Nigeria, and international education has ebbed and flowed over years. We've had much higher international and much lower. We are now hoping to increase the number of students from across the world who are studying with us, but to my knowledge, I don't think we have any South African students right now.
Thank you. I was not sure about current numbers, but there is a record it comes and goes, like there's a periodic record in our archive that at one point they were keeping track of students from other countries, and they're listed out by country. And so in the 70s, there are actually a number of students from Africa. Again, I think Nigeria may well be the highest number, but they were from a wide range of countries in Africa. Then that declined again. And so I think I've been excited to meet some students again from African countries, and more broadly that we are bringing in more international students again. Yes, Melis.
This is actually most likely an appreciation. So thank you so much for, this very valuable work and presentation. And then as you are going through this research, it also made me think about, I wonder if there's any opportunities to get together with the BSG and then maybe now have a presentation about our students, and then so that more students can learn about, the history in this campus. And one of the reasons that I'm just thinking about, so in our office, we sometimes provide programs on the multicultural mixer. We always think about what are the ways that we can, create, so let's say trivia, so that students can learn about the history of the diversity, equity, and inclusion in this campus. So I was wondering if, there's any opportunities to get together with the maybe students in the program in that capacity.
That is a fantastic idea. The Organization for Students of African Descent still exists on campus as well. They were tabling downstairs, I believe, earlier. So I've also, reaching out though to BSG as well would be a fantastic way, and as well the OEDI, your office, to try to expand our awareness of this history and of some, I think, really moments we should be really proud of here at SUNY Brockport. Thank you. All right, thank you all for attending. Thank you for watching, and thank you to our students who have made it possible for us to stream this. I really appreciate it.
Once again, thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us. We all learn a lot from you, so thank you so much. So right now, again, our Graduate Diversity Fellow, Zoe White, is going to send you a survey about your experience with us today. So please make sure to read and review that email that is going to be sent out twice this coming week. So our next Brown Bag Lunch and Learn series is going to be scheduled for for November 17th, and the topic is going to be allyship in the workplace. And our presenter is going to be Dr. Beck Orr. So as an office, we are all looking forward to see you for our next event, which is going to be on November 17th. And then we do have some cookies and chips for our audience who are with us today. So please make sure to, help yourself. And then thanks for everything. So bye.